Live. Thanks to everybody who's joining us for joining us for this lecture, Ludgate Lecture, which is a long-running series of conversations hosted by Bright Blue with some of the most interesting people in UK and world politics. And today, Bartek Stanishevsky, head of research at Bright Blue, am joined by the Right Honourable the Lord Hart of Tenby, known to most, I would suspect, as Simon Hart. During a long and illustrious career as the Member of Parliament for Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire, which began in 2010, Simon served briefly as Parliamentary Secretary for the Cabinet Office before then becoming the Secretary of State for Wales under the reign of Boris Johnson, and then, most famously, the Chief Whip during the premiership of Rishi Sunak. He has been awarded a life peerage earlier this year and recently published an excellent memoir, which I am sure many of our listeners have read. And if you have not, I encourage you to read it, titled Ungovernable, The Political Diaries of a Chief Whip. And though the memoir contains not just of his time as Chief Whip, but starts off actually with the 2019 general election. And I must say, Simon, I actually have only just got around to reading your book recently, partly because it rushed to the top of my long reading list in preparation for hosting this lecture. But it only took me 3 days to read it, which is very quick for me. It's tremendously readable, even though, it's a diary, so I wonder how readable it was in the original state. It reminded me of Marcus Aurelius when he wrote his Meditations. It was too just his diary, and the emperor was not intending for anybody to read them. But after they were discovered, they too proved to be very readable. So in that respect, your memoir is in very good company. But I suppose, maybe to begin, I wonder why you called the book Ungovernable. It seems to me that as far as countries go, the UK is actually a fairly governable country in comparison to many other much more dysfunctional democracies, or it's an old established democracy. So why ungovernable?
Well, thanks, Bartek. By the way, thank you very much for having me on and for giving me the chance. I haven't done this for a year, so I feel like I'm sort of a bit rusty coming back into the political sort of ecosystem again. And it's strange having had a year out and you look at politics and politicians and everything that's going on with a very different perspective. So I think that's actually been quite helpful, and doing the book has allowed me to sort of organise my thoughts a bit. We'll get on to the thrust of the conversation is going to be about professionalising politics, but actually, in a strange way, the book is a good place to start. Not because it's a nice plug for anybody who hasn't actually had a chance to read it yet, but because it sets the scene and explains, I hope, to some extent, like some of the challenges that we faced and which Keir Starmer is facing, by the way, only too vividly in the last few days. And we call it Ungovernable for a reason. We wanted it to be provocative. We wanted people in the media and in the public to think that this was a critique of the Conservative Party and to believe that that was the only point I was trying to make. Actually, the point goes much wider than that. And it's about, is it possible to succeed in politics anymore? And the background to that is that I started this thing in 2010, but the book covers a period between December 2019 and July 2024. So a relatively short period of recent history, 4.5 years or more, around that sort of area. And, it starts with saying, ask the question, how can you go from being unassailable in December 2019 with a huge majority, clear path ahead? We thought when we won that election, that was it. We would have at least 2 terms, and we'd be able to do all of those things which we hadn't been able to do in the preceding years. And yet, within a very short space of time, not only had we got through Boris Johnson, but we got through Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And by 2024, rather than unassailable, we'd become unelectable. So in a very short space of time, we'd burnt through a pile of political capital, 3 very different prime ministers, and rendered ourselves as the sort of least favoured option of the voting public. And what I've tried to do, what the book tries to do, is ask the question, how on earth is that possible? Are we now in just an ungovernable situation where politicians have to make promises in order to get elected, but promises which they can never deliver on, or certainly never deliver on in the timescale or at the price that they claim in manifestos and in their election campaigns they will apply. And as a result of that, the public is suffering one disappointment after another. They in the end came to the conclusion that the joke had worn a bit thin with us and that we hadn't been able to do the things maybe as well as we had claimed that we would. Then within about a metaphorical 15 minutes under Keir Starmer, huge majority, clear landscape ahead, suddenly he has encountered the most turbulent of headwinds as well. The most recent incarnation of that being last week with the rebellion or potential rebellion on welfare reform. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary from a sort of nerdy whip's office point of view to watch a government with a majority of 150 plus being unable to get its flagship legislation past second reading because of a backbench rebellion. I mean, the last time there was a backbench rebellion on a second reading debate was in 1986 under Margaret Thatcher. And that's how rare these things are. We often had threatened rebellions, but never on second reading. So that was that's sort of why I think this sort of conversation about professionalising politics is so crucial. Because if you were sat in the whip's office with me over the last couple of years, you would have heard me 10 times a day sort of muttering under my breath about one drama or sort of mysterious development after another. And I would always say to my whips colleagues, also the civil servants in the outer office of the whips office, that everything that went badly in government, every single thing that went wrong, and I could talk for 2 hours about that, but some things went well as well. But every single thing that went wrong could be attributed to one of 4 things. The first of those things is candidate selection. And actually what we were doing, and I think other parties did, wearing my Conservative hat, is we were not recruiting candidates in a way that any other industry in the UK would. We were allowing people to come to our door and make themselves known and to volunteer for this important role, which is great. We're only too keen for all of that. But we were doing very little due diligence and we were doing very little recruitment of our own. So we weren't working out what makes a good MP, what makes a good minister, what makes a good councillor, a good Senate member, in my case, in Wales. We were just letting that all happen by luck. So that was one problem. We could go on about that forever. The second was once we'd selected our candidates, we provided almost no training and guidance whatsoever. Now, it's miles better than it used to be. CCHQ are a much more professional unit than they ever were, I grant you. But I just remember this, that you get the nomination, happy days. Often that's only a few weeks out from an election, let alone a few months or a few years. And you're plunged into this maelstrom of activity without really anybody being able to tell you how you are supposed to do it in a way which is compelling and convincing and reassuring to the people upon whose vote you're going to rely. The third thing was about mentoring and continual professional development. Many years ago, I was a chartered surveyor, and anybody in the law, in medicine, in any of the professional industries will tell you that CPD has never been more important than it is now. Keeping abreast of modern technology, techniques, expectations, staff management, all of those things. We don't really do that in politics. And so we're giving a new MP a substantial budget, asking them to set up at least 2 offices, one in Westminster and one in their constituency, employing 4, 5, 6 people. But we're not really, and we're giving them the budget to support that, but we're not really giving them the professional sort of facilities in order to maximise that. Now, again, it is better than it used to be, but it's a long way from perfect. And then, of course, the thing where I used to get more involved was support for individuals in the face of adversity. And i.e., what the hell to do when the wheels fall off. And in politics, the wheels fall off a lot, or they certainly get loose. And there are all sorts of pressures which may exist in other professions, but exist particularly starkly in politics because you've always got a very bright light being shone at you at all times by the media and by social media in particular. So suddenly, when something goes wrong, who's there to pick up the pieces? And I think one of the points I've attempted to make in the book, which is actually all the people that I met who go into politics generally are good people who are going into politics for good reasons, want to do it for altruistic purposes, but are not always absolutely perfectly equipped to deal with something, as I say, when it goes badly wrong. And some of the worst examples of that, and so which I admit I deal with a bit flippantly in the book at times, some of the worst examples of that are avoidable. We could have avoided it at the candidate selection stage, or at the training stage, or at the mentoring stage, or at the CPD stage, or even actually when it's become a front page story in the Mail on Sunday. In each of those occasions, I suspect there's more that we can do, but we don't do. And the consequence of all of that, apart from giving the public plenty to feast on in terms of their critical attitude towards politicians, but it's to put off a vast swathe of the public from ever entering politics in the first place. And we thrive, and our party's survival is based on being able to attract great people from interesting backgrounds with diverse histories in order to max out our ability, but we don't do it. We're probably 10 years behind the curve. So there's only two more things, really, which I think are relevant to this. Making the distinction, too, between MPs and ministers. Even if we get the MP bit right, and we've worked out what the career path is, the route in and the route out, don't forget that at some stage, for a lot of people, sometimes quite early on in their career, they'll get the call from the PM and they'll be asked to be responsible for some ministerial role. Now, in any other industry, that normally would involve months of training, plenty of preparation, a team of people to guide you through that process, and your appointment would be a reflection of your expertise and your experience. Not so in our world. You'll get a call, as I did, from Boris Johnson back 5 or 6 years ago, a Saturday afternoon, and he rings me up. There was a reshuffle going on, so we were all nervously, staring at our phones all weekend. And I get this call, and Boris says to me, I want you to be the Minister for Implementation at the Cabinet Office, and which is slightly perplexing because I'd never heard of that. Anyway, and before I'd had a chance to react at all, Boris said, by the way, I haven't heard of it either. He said, but somebody will ring you up and tell you what it means. And I thought, and how often does that happen in Civvy Street? How often did you get offered a job and accept it? Which has got, we're responsible for large infrastructure projects within the Cabinet Office. We were dealing with multi-million-pound contracts and huge zillion-pound overspends by the big departments. I'd never had a day's training in that regard. And Boris had clearly never heard of the role, but was more than happy to dish it out. That's not his fault. But I didn't know what the role was or what's it. So what happens? That means that actually the civil service, for whom I've got the highest regard, by the way, particularly in the Cabinet Office, the civil service then essentially run the show because they do know what it all means and they do know what needs doing, and they will just make sure that the minister knows enough about the subject to be able to get away with it in Parliament. The hard graft is often done by a team of officials, which leads people to the view that maybe some of these things aren't quite as accountable as they should do. So ministers being told on a Friday afternoon that they're going to be Secretary of State in a large department. I remember this, having sat through dozens of reshuffles. They were essentially saying, right, somebody will pick you up outside, they'll take you to the department. Oh, and you're doing the media round on Sunday. Somebody will pick you up at 5:30. from your house, you've got 15 back-to-back interviews about every bit of government policy that is currently on the menu at the moment. And, PS, don't screw up. That is asking for trouble. And I don't think any properly professionalised organisation would do that. And last but not least, of course, is a lot of the heavy lifting for MPs and for ministers is done by special advisors and parliamentary staff. They're often the interface. Parliamentary staff deal with more constituents than MPs ever do. They're expected to be grief counsellors, legal advisors, financial advisors, medical professionals. They're expected to do all of these things for which most of them have never been trained and give advice, often which is life-changing advice. And we were always highly nervous about this. And there was also a sense of profound frustration when a constituent would get in touch, having basically been beaten by the system and haven't been able to get their essential cancer treatment or whatever it might be, and come to us as the last resort, thinking that never having got in touch with an MP before. We would have caseworkers in our offices who were dying to help them more, but were being basically told by me and others, you can't do that, you're not qualified. And that, I think, those three groups of people, or four if you include SPADs, who again are probably an underappreciated community within Westminster. They get all the blame. It's very easy to blame SPADs, but they do, in terms of the interface between the ministry and the outside world, they are a crucial part of the equation, crucial bit of the jigsaw. And which leads me back really just to finish to your first question, Pato, about the book and the title and therefore the role of the whips. And I used to, in those daily outbursts in my office, always used to complain about the fact that we were required to do to be a sort of HR department for our party in Parliament. We were there to provide a signpost to essential assistance that people might need, and that could be medical, or it could be financial, or it could be any number of different. We were required to, of course, do what we were actually put there to do, which is to get the government's business through two houses of Parliament. And I think it was always a bit tempting for everybody to, whatever problem had hit their department or their constituency or their lives generally, to just say, oh, the whips will sort it out. Well, the whips would try and sort it out, but we weren't always, I would argue, trained or the best people to do so. And there's sort of, in a way, no clearer example of the weirdness of the whip's office than reshuffles. And reshuffles remain the most, for some, particularly journalists, the most entertaining part of the parliamentary year. And I remember before I was a whip thinking that it would be pretty interesting to be on the inside to see how a reshuffle unfolds. And indeed, I mean, I think we ended up doing 6 during all semi and large reshuffles under Rishi's tenure. And we quickly learned that in a reshuffle, you make a lot of enemies and you make very few friends. So the people that you reassign, appoint, promote are normally people who you were pretty friendly with anyway, and are therefore grateful, but you're not converting them. Whereas to make way for them, you're losing people who've often done fantastic service over a long period of time and feel they're just in their prime, just in their stride, and feel aggrieved that they've been cut short. Their brilliant career has been cut short. And the thing about a reshuffle, and I naively hoped that we would be able to do it purely on merit, and appoint, put a round pin in a round hole. But suddenly the reality dawns that, as it did every time we did one of these things, that you need to have a balance of people from the north, people from the south, represented, Scotland, Wales represented in cabinet. You've got to have your diversity targets and your gender targets, and you've got to have your skill sets where possible best assigned to the roles that you've got available. don't forget you've got a limit, a statutory limit of 96 paid places in government. So you can't exceed that. So suddenly, what seems like just an exercise of putting really good people in really important roles and everybody proceeding happily in a unified direction actually becomes anything but that. You get a few people in a reshuffle who refuse, as Boris Johnson discovered, I think, when Sajid Javid was meant to remain as Chancellor and didn't because of a deal Number 10 tried to do over the way in which SPADs were allocated. The consequence of which was Rishi Sunak became 15 minutes after I think he was fairly comfortable where he was suddenly told him the Chancellor and thus subsequently became PM. So reshuffles in a sense, embody everything that I've been attempting to say about the fact that there are so many other forces at play in politics, that just organising it and making the arrangements based on what we would all be used to in the outside world is an almost impossible goal. It's not because of incompetence or prejudice. It's because in politics, it's all about the art of the possible. You have to do these things in a certain knowledge that it isn't, unfortunately, a meritocracy. And all of that leads us right back to the beginning, which is one of the themes I've tried to pick up on in the book a bit, which is we've got to get this right, because if we don't get it right, we're just going to deter more and more brilliant people from wanting to do this job. It's a brilliant job. It's not for everybody, but it's a brilliant job. But bloody hell, we make it difficult for people. We make it difficult we make it unappealing. We make it difficult to get in. And when you're in, we make it difficult to manage. And when you get promoted, we make it difficult to succeed. And that makes, in my view, aspects of what we're all trying to do. And we see it with the current government. We saw it with ours. And by the way, if by some miracle the reform surge continued to go forward, exactly the same thing would happen under a reform government. They would find exactly the same headwinds as Labour and Conservative have found. They will find that the solutions are not as simple as our leaders sometimes suggest they might be, or as cheap. And we end up with a brassed-off electorate who feel they've been let down yet again, and a generation of people for whom politics might have been a career path, but can't quite face it. So on the one hand, it's a sort of a gloomy outlook. On the other hand, actually, I think there is, once you can see the problems and we're prepared to hold a mirror up and confront them, there's a reasonable chance that we may be able to turn the tide a little bit and come up with a new generation of professionalised politicians who restore public confidence. And if between us all we're able to do that, I think that's our work here is done. Anyway, thank you. I think that's all. And this reminds me of, I have horrible flashbacks to doing cabinet by Zoom during the lockdown. This feels slightly like a reminder of that. All those hours I used to spend trying to see what books are on Jacob Rees-Mogg's bookshelf behind the Zoom camera and all that sort of stuff. So that's made me hand shake again. But thank you anyway. I think we've got some time for questions.
No, thank you very much, Simon. That was very, very interesting. I mean, indeed, when I was reading your book, I did kind of rushing through the COVID years. I was getting kind of, so to speak, PTSD, reliving those years. I'm like, oh no, it was so miserable back then. I didn't want to remember it.
Yeah.
But I suppose, okay, well, I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege now a little bit. I'm going to ask some questions for myself before I move on to questions from the audience. And maybe picking up on one thing that you've mentioned and that you've talked about today, and that you've hinted at in the book, but I think is not the focus of it, is the professionalization not just of elected members of parliament, but also of staffers. So in the book, you mentioned, for example, this anecdote early on when you're interviewed when Boris is trying to find out who is leaking what is happening at cabinet meetings, and you are interviewed by those two, you say 20-something staffers wearing jeans. Or later on in the book, you mention how Cummings would show up to meetings dressed as though I forgot it, as though he just
I
came
think I
back
said
from
he looked like
Glastonbury.
he'd spent. I think I said he looked like he'd spent a week at Glastonbury.
Yes, that's it. That's it,
Yeah.
right? So, you also raise this issue of, sure, there's a problem with the professionalization of MPs, but how much of a problem is there also of the professionalization of the people around them, the staffers and the media, and maybe not the spots themselves, but in general the people in the immediate surrounding of MPs, and actually how qualified and how professional are they? Is that also a part of the problem?
Well, I mean, I'm old enough to very much be of the view that there are no such thing as bad soldiers, only bad officers, and I think that everything is a reflection of the MP or the minister, or indeed you could argue the prime minister in a way, and that I think the quality of staff that MPs have is a reflection of their attention to detail, their their belief in high standards as much as it is the individuals themselves. And I think that the part of the point I was trying to make is I think that, of course, everybody sets out with ambition, but without sounding too dinosaur-like, I think that if you've never employed anybody or been employed in your life, you've never had to run an office, even a small team of 4 or 5 people. That can be quite daunting, and the recruitment process can be quite overwhelming, and you might not end up with the right person. And if you don't end up with the right person, it can be very difficult then to go through the process of replacing them. Particularly, as I say, you've just been elected. The whole thing. You're getting hundreds of messages a day from pressure from different pressure groups and charities and NGOs and lobby groups and goodness knows what else. There's a lot to think about, and I mean, it's an observation from me, and I was I think in my 40s before I was elected. I'm trying to remember, and I remember thinking, God, I'm so glad I didn't do this when I was in my 20s, because I think I would have been the worst example of what we're talking about. I think I would have been clueless in my 20s. Now, there's some brilliant people in their 20s, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't have been one of them. I needed to get to 40 before I was let loose on this kind of career path. And I think the examples you give, I remember the 2 lads who came to interview me about the leak. I mean, I think, to be fair to them, probably they're probably pretty sophisticated people. I mean, I'm assuming they were some part of some security operation, but I was probably unnecessarily rude about them. I think with Dominic, who I don't know, and haven't had a conversation with this day, by the way. I think I sort of felt that it wasn't the but I think the professional standards are not about snobbery. Professional standards are about showing respect to the institution that you're part of. Um, I'm I was one of the stuffy ones who didn't really approve of John Burke saying people could attend the chamber of the House of Commons without a tie. I thought that was a bit of a step backwards. When Jack Straw, Labour's famous former Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary, was late for a vote once, the doorkeepers wouldn't let him into the voting lobby because he didn't wear a tie. These days, people come with a gym kit and a towel around their neck, So I'm sounding very like my father now. But I think there is a point here. We work in a wonderful industry in one of the most iconic buildings in the world. With ultimate responsibility to 60 million people and a G7 style size economy, and sort of think that brings with it the requirement to try and maintain something resembling a sort of professional qualities that are expected in every other industry and profession that I can think of off the top of my head.
Thanks. And on that, I mean, on the point about ties, I really enjoyed reading about your interactions with Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is on the opposite end of that spectrum, right? Always brilliantly dressed, always very, always confirming every single stereotype about him. which I've always,
I think
from
probably
a purely
Jacob,
aesthetic perspective, I've always enjoyed that.
I think Jacob probably wears a tie to bed. But he was, he was an example of this. I mean, we didn't agree on every point, but I think, Jacob Rees-Mogg would not have been, would have contemplated dressing down for an attendance in the chamber. Wouldn't it? It was just unthinkable.
But on that point about, you say there's no bad soldiers, only bad officers. It's not every MP a sort of servus servorum. Is it not that the officers of the MPs, so to speak, are the voters? And so, it's if you cannot blame the MP for having not the perhaps not the best pick of staffers or advisors, then should we also not blame the voters for electing the MPs that they elect?
Well, I mean, I'm a believer that MPs are representatives, not delegates. I think that it is perfectly in order for MPs to consider the evidence before them and vote accordingly, even if that is contrary to the majority wishes of their electorate. That can happen. I think there were cases in the past over capital punishment, for example, where I don't think the polling would show it now, but it used to show sort of public majority. But MPs, I suppose the nearest thing is probably on assisted dying, actually, about where MPs have to make conscience-based decisions, even though their electorate may have a different view. And I think that, but our politics has become much more presidential. And if you look at the results of recent elections, there seems to be very little difference between the different constituencies in terms of voter turnout, swing, percentage, vote share, and decision. And that suggests to me that, often very different MPs, very different values, very different, attendance records, some very diligent, work like hell in their constituencies, others who are rarely seen. They all posted largely similar results in 2010, in 2024, and largely similar results in 2019. So I think the public is much more now going for the leader. They're voting for or against Boris Johnson, for or against Rishi Sunak, for or against Donald Trump in the States, for or against Keir Starmer, and that's shifted over the years. I think the incumbency value of individual MPs, it's probably a rather disappointingly low proportion of the voters turn out for the local candidate than turn out for the national leader.
I think that's fair, and it's definitely something that I've observed as well. There's this presidentialism of British politics, and actually reading your book as well, it again was something that really stuck out to me, especially in the later months of the Boris Johnson cabinet, where your description of the cabinet meetings is really just Boris dictating to you as opposed to it being any kind of discussion. Actually, a criticism that Dominic Cummings has also had. So maybe there is something that the two of you agree
maybe
on.
we have common ground after all. I mean, and I think cabinet meetings should either take 15 minutes or 4 hours. There's not much point anything in between. You either make it a sort of rubber stamping exercise where everybody's read the papers and roughly know, and we simply endorse the PM's decision, or you explore every single nuance of every single policy and sort of vote on it at the end. And I can't remember any former leader who's done the latter of those things. I think Theresa might have done, but I wasn't in the government at that time, so I don't know. I think over some of the Brexit stuff, she probably very wisely wanted to make sure that cabinet couldn't argue that they had been denied the necessary time to debate it. But I think she was the last one who did. That I don't think Liz went for long cabinet meetings that I can remember anyway.
But when the way you're describing it, it seems like it really benefits people who are really good at getting a word in, and when they do get a word in, they're really good at producing a good soundbite. What strikes me in the Parliament now actually is often when MPs make contributions in the chamber, rather than it being a contribution to the debate, it really seems like it's written beforehand and is tailored to then be clipped and put on social media. Is
I mean,
that
it
not the
is.
kind of thing that is electable? Is that not the kind of thing that attracts
I
voters?
do
Is that
find,
not
I
the
mean,
kind of thing that makes for a good politician?
I sort of think that, social media's got a lot to answer for in a million different ways, but I don't think it's necessarily, you're right, contributed to the, the raising of the standard of debate in the Commons. Interestingly, in the Lords, where, I've witnessed this for all of 1 month, where there isn't that pressure, the contributions are quite different because they're less about getting a sound bite and more about getting a point across. I remember in the Commons here when the Speaker used to impose limits, speech length limits. The debate would start with 10 minutes per member, and if it was a heavily subscribed and it ran over, by the end you were given 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And sometimes actually the 3 minute speech was a lot better than the 10 minute speech because people were able to crystallise their thoughts and make their points. And I think probably better from the point of view of social media too. But yeah. I think it's a reasonable point.
Oh, brevity is the soul of wit.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe to be a bit of a devil's advocate, it seems to me like the model you're pushing for, your ideal for politicians, is something that's a little bit closer maybe to the political culture we see in Germany. And I've often thought of there being a sort of spectrum of political culture, where on one end you have the kind of political culture you see maybe in the Balkans, where politics is all about showmanship, arguing, not much of it is substantive policy discussion. And on the other end, you have the Germans, where politicians are a lot like civil servants, where it isn't meant to be interesting and showy. It is meant to be a dull affair because they're there to do their job. And I think a lot of people see the UK as a kind of actually a good middle ground between those two, where politics is still interesting, it's still engaging, it's still a vibrant democracy where people want to follow politics, and it attracts people like Boris Johnson with really strong, flamboyant personalities, but doesn't collapse into the kind of utter chaos of what you sometimes see in Eastern European countries. Would you like to see a more German style politics in the UK?
I mean, it's funny in the UK, we yearn for the flamboyant and then get bored of the flamboyant quite quickly. And always then the sort of pendulum swings too far the other way. People love the flamboyance of Tony Blair, but wanted to compensate for that eventually. It was seen to be too theatrical, and so we ended up with Gordon Brown, who then people complained was too dull. Probably both descriptions so the description of Blair and Brown probably were rather unfair. I remember with the demise of Boris, everybody sort of thinking, well, it would be slightly better now to have some sort of, slightly more subdued version of politics and get back to the sort of day-to-day, behave more like a local authority than a sort of flamboyant operation that Boris was running. And then, we get bored of that. So, I don't know. I think we can be a bit, what's the word I'm looking for? We can be a bit indecisive about what it is we really do want. As I say, we when we want flamboyance, we think it's too flamboyant. When we want bank manager style leadership, we think it's too boring. I don't know. For me, I can only reflect what my former electorate in my constituency used to yearn for, which was a sort of, and they were quite Cameroonian, is that the right word? They quite liked the David Cameron hybrid, which was somebody who was flamboyant performer, looked and sounded good on the public stage, looked at home, when he was entertaining the president of the US and that sort of thing. But at the same time ran a tidy ship, had George Osborne grinding away in the Treasury, doing unpopular things for the public good. And that seemed to work. And I personally, one of the reasons I was a big supporter of Rishi is I thought that's where we were just trying to get back to a bit, which is reassuring, the government being there to make sure nothing fell apart if it was possible, and that the things which really matter were safeguarded. A little bit less theatre, a bit more management. Yeah, that's probably where I am, which possibly explains why I lost my seat, because it's quite a boring offer. It's you know. So maybe I should have stood on a cliff top shouting "Stop the boats" more loudly, and that would have been the difference. I don't know. I will
Well,
never
very
know.
good of you to be so introspective. Have you ever heard about the jock geek theory of prime ministers?
No.
So the theory goes, it's kind of broken down actually with Rishi because he was probably more of a geek than a jock, but that in turn we always alternated between a prime minister who's a jock and a geek. So if you think about Margaret Thatcher, she was probably more of a jock. Then Major after her was more of a geek. Then Blair was more of a jock. Then Gordon
Yeah.
Brown was more of a yeah.
I think that's what we've been witnessing. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, speaking about this professionalization of politics, I think in general, Gove said many years ago now that people are tired of experts. And I think there's a bit of a distaste. Is distaste the right word? People are concerned about technocrats, about people being appointed into positions, about people not reflecting the will of the people. Um, I wonder how much appetite. I mean, yeah, I wonder how much appetite there is amongst the public for professionalization of politics, and actually how much appetite there is for. I mean, you've already shown some introspection about this, right? That maybe this is why you lost the election. But okay, so maybe in that case, my question is, how could this be sold? How could this be sold to people if people want somebody who is less professional, who is, let's say, a straight talker? How can professionalism possibly be sold to the voters?
Michael Gove, I think, did have a bit of a point, and I can't remember if it was in the context of Brexit that he, as of COVID, that he
Yeah.
made those comments. And I do remember there was a frustration occasionally in we were. It used to annoy us that there were the media would haul in people who had impressive sounding qualifications to basically provide a sort of running critique of the government's performance. But when you got under them, when you looked actually what those qualifications were, they weren't necessarily at the same sort of epidemiology as we were dealing with in terms of pandemic control. And it was annoying that people were almost masquerading as authorities on the subject when in all reality they weren't. Now the big names on the telly probably were fine, but it was a golden age for anybody who'd done a sort of science degree at university or medical degree to just get on the airwaves and make a name for themselves. And I think that was quite frustrating in a time when the public was confused enough as it was. But the other point, it's interesting how, again, selective we can be about this, because in my experience, we were only too delighted for former soldiers, airmen or sailors, to be part of the MOD lineup. And in our day, in Ben Wallace, James Heapy, Johnny Mercer, there was actually quite a lot of confidence was derived from the fact that these people had served in the armed forces. Some of them had seen active service, and that was considered to be a great plus. And I think that where we've had former medics in the Department of Health, that's always it doesn't seem to necessarily transfer to people wanting investment bankers in the Treasury. But I think we do make some strange judgments about all of those sort of things. But we had farmer George Eustace was a very good farming minister. Mark Spencer was a very good farming minister. People whose careers and families had been steeped in agriculture. I think that certainly gave confidence to the industry, even if it might have been a bit lost on members of the public. So I think we're a bit schizophrenic about that. I think we like it sometimes, we don't like it. We like it when it suits us, and I think I don't know the detail of it, but I think the current government is attempting to do a bit of that too. I think Al Khan's in the MOD is as Armed Forces Minister is an obvious example of somebody who a long and distinguished military career going straight into the MOD, almost on day one. He didn't even serve on the back bench, straight into the MOD. I think there's a certain logic to that.
That's a good point. And when I was younger, I remember I did think that I had this idea that to be appointed as a minister in a relevant department, it should be a requirement that you have a minimum number of years of experience in the relevant industry. So say you have to have been a teacher for 5 years to work in education. And you do make a good point that maybe it's not necessarily schizophrenic, that it's about balancing different concerns. And when you were describing how Liz Truss went about appointing her ministers, how there was no balance, how it was just about appointing Truss loyalists, and then Rishi did the opposite, right? Where Rishi really tried to seek out a compromise, where he really tried to balance all those different concerns, where probably professionalism and merit is one of them, but you also have to be really careful about their age, their experience, what part of the country they're from, their gender, and party loyalty. And I wonder if you think, and this is a final question from me before I move on to questions from the audience, I wonder if you think if Rishi should actually have been a bit more ruthless, if he should have, so to speak, laid down the law when he first came in and been more firm, say, with Suella. I mean, when I remember the best teachers when I was back in school were always the ones who were very harsh and for the first few lessons we had together, and then became much more friendly later on, while Rishi seems to have done the opposite.
Well, it's a question I've often agonised over since that time. And one of Rishi's strengths in this, in the way in which he used to address these things, was he never wanted to react to sort of the wrong kind of pressure, i.e., there were many occasions when somebody had probably gone way off piste and had overplayed their hand, said something which would be provocative, and my reaction tended to be more of let's deal with this in a very public and sort of brutal way. Whereas Rishi's view was always, no, look, we've got bigger fish to fry than this. We've got a country to run. He was very high level. All we're going to do is create martyrs. There's no point if they want to voice off in the media, or if they want to voice off on social media, let them do it. But our job is to try and keep our eyes and minds focused on the main reason we're here. So he and I, and by 3 hours into the day, I'd calmed down a bit and was sort of much more sanguine about it. If we were to live our lives again, would we have done? Yeah, of course we would have done a few things a little bit differently. But as I say, Rishi's view was always, no, just good referee in the rugby, just let the fight burn out a bit and we'll move on, not to get too distracted by that sort of thing. And I haven't had a conversation with him about it for months, but I think he just didn't want us all to get distracted by, fighting fires, fighting sort of little fires. We wanted to fight big fires, not little ones.
The feeling I always got is that he really strongly believed in people being innocent until proven guilty, and perhaps the public is sometimes a little bit out for blood.
Well, I think Rishi's, by the way, the theme of this talk is about professionalism. I think Rishi definitely believed, having come from a financial services background, where these things are probably, written in large red letters, and you have to comply with them. His view was always that he expected people to maintain decent professional standards. Didn't necessarily have to be told. That just came with the territory. If you were a member of a government anywhere, that brought with it a level of professional responsibility. Not everybody was able to achieve that, but a lot of people did. I mean, we had some very good people, and they don't always get talked about.
Okay, so moving on now a little bit. Here is a question from somebody watching the live stream from Slido, and the question says, Given what you said about reshuffles and the natures of cabinet politics, what advice would you give to the current Starmer government in the aftermath of their rebellion?
Well, it's interesting to see the scale of what's happened and what's happened so quickly. If I was, it's not for me to advise, Alan Campbell. He's a great man and he knows his way around this. But this will all be a number 10 problem rather than a whip's office problem. But they've got to stop backing themselves into corners. They keep ruling out options unnecessarily. The thing about politics, it's the art of the possible. It's what the numbers allow. And some of the things that Rachel Reeves has done, which is just basically say, all the things we're not going to do, that just removes the ability to be flexible and to be deft and to be able to use your feet, because there's going to be more of this. And I think with as we were saying earlier on, with a bunch of MPs who are feeling some heat for the first time in their professional life, the government needs to keep all of its options open. And that means, avoid fights you don't need to have, to be able to be flexible, but not in the face of a rebellion. You want to deal with all of these things way before that happens. So I think it'd be a little bit less dogmatic in number 10, and get a better assessment of what listen to the whip's office is my advice, as you'd expect it to be, because they will know exactly what's going on.
But isn't a lot of that confidence, a lot of the reason why they've backed themselves into a corner is try to bring confidence to people, is try to say, look, we're not, I think Labour often have this reputation for maybe not being quite as competent as the Tories, but maybe having a bigger heart, and then trying to say, look, we have clear principles, we're going to stick by them. You don't have to panic, you don't have to worry about us doing something crazy.
Well, the problem is that they've done, which is the mistake I keep referring back to. They've, in 14 years of opposition, all they really promised was, look, to the public is vote us in and your headache will go away. And they weren't in a position to do that, because as Rachel Reeves is now discovering, there were going to be very few options open to her in the autumn if she is to achieve growth, which is the government's number one stated intention. All of her fiscal headroom has now been removed. So I don't want, without having to go back to the to the taxpayer and extract, she said no more taxes for working people. Where is the solution now? And so those things, some of the things she said she didn't need to say, but she's now, she's put barriers up, which you'll either have to U-turn, which we know, and of course the backbenchers know that you don't have to push this government too hard before it falls over. And so she's faced with an unenviable choice of either having to say, do U-turns, or to give up on her ambition for growth. And she didn't need to do half that stuff.
Very, very wise, I think. Here's another question from the audience. So somebody asks, what concrete steps can be taken to attract the right people to the party, or I suppose into politics, both in terms of experience and temperament? I mean, a lot of us wonks talk about how actually politicians are underpaid, if you compare it to, but yeah, besides pay, which is the obvious one, and I wonder if MPs could ever compete with the kind of salaries that, say, corporate lawyers get. What would attract the right people into politics?
I'm not I think the pay thing can be a bit of a distraction at times, because I think there's a lot of people who would come into politics on the back of a successful career somewhere else. They've got their pensions. They don't, the expensive part of their life is behind them, and therefore, they probably, don't necessarily need to maintain the level of income they've been on for that lengthy period of time. I think we need to do more active recruiting. I think we need to be going out into the community and identifying people who are particularly outstanding in their field, and sow the seed, a proper headhunting exercise, and sow the seed and say, look, you would be a really valuable asset to our party or our nation have you ever considered? And literally go looking for people, identify what makes a good MP, what makes a good minister, which is probably a very different thing than it was 10 or 15, 20 years ago, and actively go after them. That would be time consuming and it would be expensive. But if we were successful in 3 out of 10 times, we would be improving the overall quality of the gene pool immeasurably. And I think we probably all know people who are brilliant, been brilliant doctors or brilliant factory managers or brilliant engineers or whatever it might be, probably never thought about it, a life in politics. Never crossed their mind that it's something that they could or should or would love to do. And I think we've got to go out and evangelize a bit and say, look, you'd be good at this. Okay, you're not going to, it'll be less money than you're on now, but the rewards, the non-financial rewards are enormous. And I would love to see a bit more versatility in our recruitment.
I wonder if the incentives are in the right place. I mean, Plato says in the Republic that the only people who should be rulers are those who do not want to rule.
Well, there is, I think David Cameron sort of touched on this with his call to arms in 2009 or 2008, I think. And I think there was something in that somebody who is reluctant and who never thought it was for them might actually be quite good. Those are the people we've got to identify. And I mean, I think the idea of meeting people who say, God, I'm the wrong person. They're probably the right person. Probably some really good people out there who just don't know it.
Here's maybe quite a radical idea, but something that I've been entertaining in the back of my head for a while. I wonder if we could do something like, after the MPs get elected, there's a few months before they actually enter Parliament where they're subject to compulsory training. And there could be some non-party political body in charge of selecting experts who would be in charge of educating MPs. And it would be people like political philosophers, constitutional lawyers. If we're going to a certain department, then people who are experts in that given area. And every single MP would have to go through it. And they would also learn about parliamentary procedures. They would learn about how the actual inner system of politics works. Does that sound realistic?
I've always been a fan of something, a model along those lines. The reason it is that you've just come off the back of a 5-6 week exhausting election campaign, and most people have had a daily sort of punishment regime, and you're elected, and you go straight to Parliament, and on day one. You are expected, you don't have an office, you don't have your IT support, you haven't recruited, you haven't identified an office in your constituency, you haven't hired your staff, you don't know what the language means. It's a mystery. It's like going to a new school in a foreign country. It's all a mystery. And yet you're expected to start the next day, the very next day. I've always thought, right since 2010, the sensible thing to do would be you have an election, you elect a new government, and Parliament immediately goes into recess for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. During recess, you assemble the government. You play in your ministers. The ministers are able to get their heads around their brief. You can set up your office. You can do all of that admin stuff. And your suggestion is that you can also get some rudimentary training in technique and procedure and all of that. I think would be transformational. I think we should definitely do it. I'm not picking up any signs that it's on the cards, but I would love to see something like that happen and make a big difference.
Oh, splendid. Maybe we should start a campaign. I know a lot of
maybe I should.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that this is all that we have time for, but thank you ever so much, Simon, for joining us today. I thought this was really interesting. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I hope you enjoyed it too.
Thanks very much. No, always fun, and we'll see you again.
And see you again, Simon. And to everybody watching, thank you very much for watching. And this is just one of many Bright Blue Ludgate lectures. We also have others with people such as Paul Morland, with Sir Paul Collier, with Lawrence Newport, with Sir Anthony Selden. And you can find all of them on our YouTube. And if you found this so good that you want to listen to it again, then you will be able to find it on our YouTube later today as well. Once again, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you everybody for listening. And thank you very much again, Simon, for